If you want to understand a Viking raider, you have to begin long before the longships, before the shield walls, and before the first monastery bell began ringing in alarm. You have to start in the north itself, this wide, cold landscape of ice, rock, and stubborn beauty. A place where winter does not knock before entering. It simply pushes the door open and settles in. The world of the Vikings was shaped as much by weather as by any king. Harsh winters rolled in early. Summers were short and precious, almost shy in how quickly they came and went. The fields, even on their best days, demanded hard work. The soil was not generous, and it never promised anything for free. If you wanted grain, you fought for it. If you wanted livestock to survive the winter, you planned months ahead. In many ways, the land taught the Vikings a simple lesson from childhood. Nothing is guaranteed, and you have to be ready to move when the world stops giving. This environment produced more than strong backs. It produced a certain mindset, one that mixed caution with courage, patience with boldness. When the sea froze along the edges and the wind howled down from the mountains, a man had plenty of time to think. And when he thought, he often dreamed of other shores, other opportunities, and other futures. The world beyond the horizon became more than just a mystery. It became a promise. Warmer lands, easier fields, markets full of silver and spices, and villages that, if one was being honest, looked a little too peaceful for their own good. Scandinavia itself was a patchwork of fjords, forests, and scattered farms. The fjords cut deep into the coastline like long silver blades. They made travel by sea not only possible, but often easier than walking across a single mountain. The forests were thick and dark, full of game, but also full of long distances. Between them lay villages, small, tough places built by families who had worked the same land for generations. There were no great cities, no massive palace walls, no wide roads stretching from region to region. Instead, life was built around smaller communities, clusters of longhouses, barns, workshops, and boathouses. The biggest political unit for most people was not a country, but a clan, or a local chieftain's domain. Your world was made of the people you shared meals with, the people you laughed with, the people you argued with, and the people you trusted to stand beside you in a fight. Clan loyalty meant everything. Blood ties were the glue of society. Honor wasn't a fancy idea, it was your savings account, your reputation, and your social insurance all in one. If you lost your honor, it was like losing your roof in a storm. Bad news, and fast. If you protected it, people would support you in times of need. And if you built it up, you could rise in the world. Honor also worked in a strange way in the north. It wasn't just about being brave. It wasn't about yelling loudly in battle or about collecting shiny weapons. It was about keeping promises, paying debts, showing up when the clan called for help, staying strong when the storms rolled in. In a land this tough, bragging was cheap. Actions mattered more. Because of this, raiding, believe it or not, was not always seen as simple violence. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, it was rough. But in the early Viking Age, it was also a job, a seasonal job, at that. You might fish, farm, hunt, or craft tools for most of the year. But when the summer sun returned and the seas opened up, young men might gather at the shore, look at the longships, and whisper about heading west for a few months. The same way someone today might say, "Hey, maybe I'll pick up some overtime." A Viking might say, "Maybe I'll join this raid, bring back some silver." Nothing too wild. Of course, that sounds calmer than reality, but it shows how raiding grew out of the environment. When your home is cold, your land limited, and your resources unpredictable, you look outward, not out of cruelty, but out of survival and ambition. The political landscape of the north also pushed men toward the sea. There were no unified kingdoms yet. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden existed only as ideas, not as nations with borders. Power shifted constantly. A strong chieftain might rise one year and fall the next. A war between two powerful families could last for generations. This constant change made many young men restless. They searched for opportunities that didn't depend on the rise or fall of some distant leader. And the sea, with all its danger, offered opportunity. It connected villages in a way the land never could. A man who could command a ship, or even just row well, suddenly had access to a world far larger than his own. Still, raiding wasn't the only thing waiting across the waves. The Viking world was full of stories of rich trade towns, distant markets, and lands where grapes grew wild. Sagas of warm beaches and soft breezes sounded almost unreal to someone who had just spent 6 months breaking ice from his doorway. Even if half the tales were exaggerated, they sparked the imagination. But before a Viking dreamed of foreign shores, he stood on the land that raised him. The mountains shaped his view of the sky. The cold shaped his daily habits. The long, dark winters shaped his thoughts. The forests shaped his skills. And the sea shaped his courage. It is no surprise that a people raised in such a landscape grew bold, not reckless, despite the stereotypes. Bold, practical, willing to test themselves. The world forced them to. If your roof leaked, you fixed it in the snow. If a storm took your fishing boat, you built another. If the harvest was poor, you stored less and stretched more. Life taught resilience not through speeches, but through experience. This mix of hardship and beauty produced a culture unlike any other. The people of this world were tied to their land, yet always looking beyond it. They were farmers and fishermen, but they were also explorers. They were shaped by scarcity, but they dreamed of abundance. And when those dreams met the edge of the sea, the longships began to move. So before we sail with the raiders, before we hear the thump of oars or the rustle of shields, we pause here in the stillness of the northern world, in the crunch of snow beneath boots, in the crackle of a fire in a longhouse, in the quiet strength of a people shaped by ice and ash. This is where the Viking story begins, not with conquest, not with battle cries, but with a land that demanded courage and a people who answered. If you stepped into a Viking village on a quiet morning, the first thing you would notice is not the warriors, or the weapons, or even the boats waiting by the shore. You would notice the longhouses, those low, solid buildings, shaped like giant wooden beasts, resting on the earth. They were warm, welcoming in their own rugged way, and filled with the sounds of daily life. These longhouses were more than homes. They were the heart of Viking society, the place where family, work, and belief mixed together like stew in a pot. A longhouse was built with curved timber, packed walls, and a roof often covered in turf. If you looked at one from a distance, it seemed to grow right out of the land, as if it had always been there and always would be. Inside, smoke drifted lazily toward a hole in the ceiling. The fire burned in the center, glowing like a second sun on dark days. Around it, people moved with a rhythm that came from living close together in a small space. There was little privacy, but plenty of warmth, physical and emotional. Family roles were clear, practical, and shaped by necessity. Life in the north demanded teamwork. The head of the household, often the father or an older relative, carried responsibility for decisions, alliances, and the family's standing in the community. But make no mistake, Viking women were not sitting quietly in corners waiting for instructions. They ran the household with authority. They managed stores of food, oversaw weaving and textile work, directed servants or thralls, and kept the place running while the men were out fishing, trading, or raiding. If the family had wealth or status, the woman controlled the house keys, which was not just symbolic. The keys meant she managed the valuables locked inside storage chests. Children, of course, brought noise, energy, and chores. A lot of chores. In a Viking family, you didn't wait until age 18 to start helping. You helped when you could walk, maybe even earlier if you were ambitious. Young children fed animals, collected firewood, fetched water, and learned from watching parents and older siblings. This wasn't harsh, it was simply life. A family survived by working as one. Above the everyday tasks, something else structured the household. Social class. Viking society wasn't flat, it was layered. At the top were the jarls, the nobles, wealthy leaders, landowners, and seasoned warriors. Below them were the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who made up most of society. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved workers who did the hardest labor and had few rights. People sometimes imagine jarls living in giant halls filled with gold and roasted boar legs. That's partly true. Jarls did have larger longhouses, more decorated rooms, and richer feasts. But even they still dealt with the same cold winters, the same muddy boots, and the same stubborn livestock that everyone else did. Power helped, but it didn't turn Scandinavia into a luxury resort. The carls, the ordinary free people, were truly the backbone of Viking life. They farmed, fished, repaired tools, kept the longships up, and formed the bulk of raiding crews. Their longhouses were simpler, but still full of laughter, arguments, good meals, and quiet evenings around the hearth. As for thralls, their lives were hard. They might be prisoners from raids, people in debt, or those born into slavery. They worked in fields, tended animals, chopped wood, hauled water, and handled the rough tasks no one else wanted. And yet, not all thrall lives were identical. Some were treated fairly well, especially if they were skilled or worked closely with a family for years. In some cases, a thrall could even gain freedom. But the difference in status was clear, and everyone in the house knew where they stood. Even with these divides, the longhouse itself acted as a kind of equalizer. When the wind roared outside or snow piled against the walls, everyone needed the same warmth and food. The hearth was the great unifier. It glowed at all hours, the bright center of the house. Around it, people cooked, talked, repaired clothing, sharpened tools, and told stories. It was the stage for daily life and the backdrop for rituals. Storytelling was the true entertainment of the Viking world. Without books, screens, or even much quiet time alone, stories flowed like water. Someone always had a saga to share, usually one they had heard from someone who heard it from someone who heard it from a wandering trader 20 years earlier. Details changed. Heroes became larger, monsters became more dramatic, but the spirit of the stories stayed alive. Through these tales, children learned values, bravery, loyalty, hospitality, and the idea that every person had a place in a larger story. Adults listened to even hardened raiders liked a good tale. After all, a long winter night is long for everyone. A story could make the time pass easily. Feasting added another layer to the social life of the longhouse. When the harvest went well, or when travelers returned, families held gatherings. Food was simple but hearty. Stews, breads, dried fish, smoked meats, cheese, and whatever ale or mead was available. Feasts also served political purposes. Deals were made at the table. Marriages were arranged. Friendships strengthened. A jarl could show his power by hosting a feast that everyone remembered, preferably for good reasons, like the quality of the food, not for bad ones. Like the goat wandering across the table, rituals played a quiet but steady role in the household. The Vikings lived in a world they believed was full of spirits, some friendly, some not so friendly. They offered small sacrifices for protection. They carved runes for luck. They whispered to gods before difficult tasks. Even simple moments, like placing a new tool on the shelf or opening a chest of stored grain, came with habits shaped by belief. A household wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The unseen world was always nearby, hovering like a second layer of reality. And what about raiding? How did that fit into all of this peaceful, smoky, longhouse life? Surprisingly, raiding was not the main defining feature of a household. It was a piece of the economic puzzle, a seasonal activity, something a family might rely on, but not something that replaced daily chores. Families planned their year around planting, harvesting, fishing, and crafting. When summer came and the ships left, the house simply shifted roles. Women took greater control. Older men oversaw tasks normally done by younger ones. Thralls took on more work. Life didn't stop, it simply adjusted. The longhouse kept breathing, as it always did. When raiders returned with silver, cloth, jewelry, or tools, the household gained more than wealth. It gained status. A successful raider might bring home something as simple as a better knife, or as grand as a chest of coins. But even small items could make a big difference in daily life. A new iron tool could change a farm's productivity. A foreign textile could keep someone warm in winter. Plunder wasn't just treasure, it was improvement. But beyond objects, there was something even more powerful. Stories. A raider returning home with tales of far places brought excitement to the longhouse. Children listened with wide eyes. Adults listened with knowing nods. Some details were probably exaggerated, and then 50 warriors jumped out at me, and I fought them with a spoon. But the spirit of it mattered. Inside the longhouse, life felt close, warm, and shared. You heard each person breathe. You felt the same fire heat your skin. You slept only a few steps from where you ate. You learned every voice, every laugh, every habit. It was messy sometimes, loud sometimes, and busy always, but it was home. And that home shaped every Viking raider long before they stepped onto a ship. The longhouse formed their values, trained their patience, and taught them the meaning of loyalty. It gave them comfort in a harsh world, and a place to return when the sea finally calmed. If you picture a Viking child, you might imagine a tiny warrior swinging a wooden sword, yelling something heroic, and jumping off a rock with full confidence and zero fear. And honestly, that's not too far off. Viking childhood was lively, tough, and full of lessons, some taught by parents, some by nature, and some by life, simply refusing to slow down. A Viking child grew up in a world that did not pause for anyone. The longhouse buzzed with work from sunrise to sunset, and every pair of hands mattered. From the moment a child could walk without face planting into a wall, someone handed them a small task. Nothing dramatic, just collecting eggs, feeding goats, carrying firewood, or bringing water from a nearby stream. These chores were not punishments. They were introductions to real life. In a land where winters could freeze a bucket of water overnight, teaching responsibility early was a survival strategy. Children also learned by watching in a longhouse. There were no secret rooms or quiet offices. Everything happened out in the open. You learned how to sharpen a knife because your uncle sharpened a knife 10 feet away from you every day. You learned how to mend clothes because your mother showed you how to thread a needle in the glow of the hearth. If someone was weaving, carving, repairing a tool, or preparing fish, a child was probably nearby peeking, asking questions, or trying to help in a way that sometimes made the job harder but always made it more interesting. One thing that shaped children more than anything was the sagas. Parents didn't read bedtime stories from books. Instead, they told tales long, dramatic, and full of heroes, monsters, gods, and explorers. These stories were not just entertainment. They were lessons about courage, loyalty, cleverness, and the unpredictable nature of fate. A child could grow up feeling they already knew Odin, Thor, or Freya personally. The gods were not distant. They were part of daily life, woven into chores, meals, storms, and dreams. Because the sagas were such a big part of childhood, Viking kids gained a strong sense of identity early. They knew who their ancestors were. They knew what their family valued. They knew what kind of person they were expected to become. And when a parent told a child, "You come from strong people," it wasn't a casual compliment. It was a reminder of generations who had survived harsh winters, long voyages, and battles that would make any modern person slowly back away. Physical training, though informal, started early. Children spent much of their time outdoors. They climbed trees, chased animals, and played games that were really just sneaky exercise routines. Running, wrestling, swimming, and lifting small stones were all part of playtime. A child didn't need a gym to get strong. Nature took care of that. Boys, especially, were encouraged to build toughness. They practiced throwing spears carefully, most of the time, swinging small axes made of wood, and learning how to handle a shield. But it wasn't all about fighting. A Viking boy also learned to fish, carve wood, tie knots, and work on a boat. Being useful mattered as much as being brave. In fact, bravery meant little if a boy couldn't help repair a fence or haul a fishing net. Girls faced their own demanding training. They learned spinning, weaving, preparing food, treating minor injuries, and managing a household. These skills were not light tasks. Weaving, for example, was complex, slow, and absolutely essential. A single blanket or sail could take weeks or even months of work. A girl who mastered these skills held real power. In many ways, she shaped the comfort and survival of the entire family. But make no mistake, Viking girls were not fragile. They climbed trees too. They ran with the boys. Some even learned to handle weapons or join hunting or fishing trips. The idea that girls should sit quietly and wait for things to happen simply didn't exist. Life needed everyone to be strong. Another important part of childhood was the steady introduction to the sea. Children grew up hearing the waves crash against the shore and seeing longships glide across the water like giant wooden arrows. A child might help repair nets, scrape barnacles off boats, or hold ropes during small fishing trips. Balance and confidence on water developed naturally. By the time they were teenagers, most Viking children could handle a boat better than many adults in calmer parts of the world. But Viking childhood was not all chores and training. There was fun too. Games were common stick games, board games like Hennefertoff, a strategy game older than chess, running races, and snowball fights in winter. Children carved their own toys from wood or bone, animals, small boats, dolls, and little versions of tools. Sometimes the fun was simple, rolling down a hill, trying to stay awake during a long storytelling night, or daring each other to jump across a freezing stream. And yes, there were occasional moments of mischief. A child might hide a tool to avoid chores, sneak extra dried fish, or chase chickens for no logical reason other than it seemed fun at the time. Parents usually handled this with a mix of patience and firm reminders that life was easier when everyone did their part. As children grew older, they gained more responsibility. A 10-year-old might watch younger siblings, help herd animals, or work in the fields. A 12-year-old could join fishing trips, carve household tools, or assist in building repairs. Teenagers often took on adult tasks. A 15-year-old boy might join his first voyage across the fjord. A 15-year-old girl might oversee parts of the home or negotiate small exchanges with neighbors. Honor and reputation started forming early. A child who worked well was praised. One who avoided work earned a reputation that followed them into adulthood, and no one wanted to be known as the person who always vanished when there was firewood to split. Viking society valued strength, reliability, and honesty. Children learned these values just as naturally as they learned to tie their shoes, except, of course, there were no shoes with laces, only leather straps that loved to come undone at the worst moments. Another major part of growing up was the community. Children didn't just belong to their parents, they belonged to the village. Neighbors corrected them, taught them skills, and told them stories. If a child needed guidance, almost any adult would step in. In a place where everyone's survival depended on cooperation, raising a child was a shared investment. As children reached adulthood, often marked by early teens or mid-teens, they carried with them not just skills, but a mindset. They learned patience because life required it. They learned toughness because the land demanded it. They learned respect because everyone depended on everyone. And they learned curiosity about the world beyond the fjord, beyond the forests, beyond the familiar paths of childhood. For boys, this curiosity sometimes led to the lordships. For girls, it often led to building households of their own. But both paths began with the same foundation, a childhood shaped by nature, family, community, and a constant mix of responsibility and adventure. By the time a Viking child became an adult, they were not simply prepared for life. They were part of a living tradition, a chain of people, shaped by the land, by the stories, and by the steady work of generations. Their childhood forged the values that would carry them into voyages, marriages, battles, or leadership. And in this world, childhood was not a small chapter. It was the training ground for everything that came next. As the morning fog settles across the Scandinavian lowlands, it becomes easier to understand a truth that is often forgotten in dramatic retellings of Viking history. The men who sailed across the North Sea, who stormed monasteries or traded in distant markets, were also farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and family members. Their lives, even those of seasoned raiders, were anchored in the rhythms of home. The raiding season, for all its danger and excitement, occupied only a fraction of their time. The rest of their days unfolded in long houses warmed by hearth fires, on fields framing the fjords, or along paths carved through dense spruce forests. This chapter invites you into that quieter world, the domestic, routine, and essential life that made a Viking raider possible. Without the household, after all, there was no warrior. There was only a man, bound to a family and tied to the land. Imagine approaching a Viking farmstead. The structure that dominates your view is the Longhausen, elongated building with gently curving walls that resemble the hull of a ship turned upside down. Some longhouses reached 60 meters in length, though most were smaller. Built from timber, turf, and thatch, they were sturdy, wind-resistant, and designed to endure harsh winters. Their entrances were narrow, sometimes set low, helping to keep out the cold. Smoke from the central hearth would escape through small vents in the roof, although it would linger in the rafters, staining beams black and giving the interior a warm, smoky hue. Inside, the space is dim, lit softly by firelight and occasional oil lamps. The air smells of wood, wool, and cooked fish. Along the walls are benches lined with furs, serving as seats by day and beds at night. The central aisle is clearly used for movement, work, and the small rituals of daily life. Animals sometimes shared this space, especially during winter months when their body heat provided free insulation. In many households, sheep, goats, or calves occupied the far end of the building, separated from the main living area by a simple partition. The hearth is the beating heart of the longhouse. It is where meals are cooked, where stories are told, where tools are mended, and where families warm themselves during the long Scandinavian nights. It is also a sacred place, watched over by household spirits known as Landvita, or by the favor of the gods. A small bowl or carved figure, set discreetly near the fire, might receive offerings of mead, milk, or a scrap of bread in hopes of securing good fortune. Daily life in such a household began early. Long before a raider thought about sharpening his sword or plotting a voyage, he rose to tend the animals, fetch water from a river or well, or repair a section of fence battered by storms. The women of the household who were central to its economic success saw food storage, weaving, child-rearing, and the complex work of preparing meals from limited resources. Their responsibilities extended far beyond the domestic sphere. Viking women managed farms when their husbands were away, oversaw laborers, negotiated with neighbors, and maintained the household's wealth in the form of textiles, which functioned as both clothing and currency. The economy of a Viking family was deeply tied to the seasons. Spring brought planting and the preparation of fields. Summer meant fishing, haymaking, and, for some men, voyages or raids. Autumn was a time of harvest, slaughtering livestock for winter storage, and repairing boats for the next year. Winter, though harsh, offered periods of rest. Families stayed indoors, spinning wool, curing hides, carving wood, and reciting long sagas that tethered them to their ancestors. Textiles were among the most valuable assets of the household. Spinning wool into yarn and weaving it into cloth was an essential task, performed mostly by women. A single sail for a Viking longship required hundreds of kilograms of wool and months of weaving. Without these sails, no raider could leave the fjords. Thus, while sagas often glorify the warrior, the practical mechanics of Viking exploration depended on the quiet work done at home. Meals were simple but sustaining. Fish both fresh and dried was a staple, as were barley, rye, and oats. Cabbage, leeks, and root vegetables grew in small kitchen gardens. Meat was eaten when available: pork, mutton, beef, and occasional game. Dairy products, especially butter, cheese, and skyr, were important sources of nutrition. Food preservation dominated household life: drying, smoking, fermenting, and storing everything possible for the winter months. Amid these domestic routines, the social fabric of Viking life was woven carefully and deliberately. Honor and reputation were cultivated within the household long before they were tested abroad. A child learned not only the skills needed for adulthood: hunting, farming, weaving, or navigating, but also the expectations of behavior that shaped the community. Hospitality was a sacred duty. A guest arriving at the longhouse could expect warmth, food, and safety before being asked for their name or business. In return, a guest was expected to behave respectfully and offer sincere gratitude. The household also held emotional significance. Many Vikings viewed the family farm as an inheritance from their ancestors, a sacred trust to be maintained, expanded, or defended. Land was not merely property, but identity. The longhouse was a vessel of memory, with past generations believed to linger in its beams and walls. This sense of continuity shaped how raiders thought about their missions. They did not raid simply for adventure, but to acquire wealth that maintained or elevated their household's standing. A raider preparing for a voyage depended entirely on this domestic infrastructure. His weapons were often forged or repaired by local blacksmiths, his clothing spun and woven within his home, and his provisions gathered by his family. Before departure, rituals might be performed near the hearth or outdoors, offering thanks to the gods and asking for protection. The departure itself was a community event, with families gathering along the shore to watch the longship glide away, its crew hopeful and anxious. When raiders returned, days, weeks, or months later, they brought not only silver, goods, or stories, but changes to the household's fortunes. A successful voyage could mean a new roof, additional livestock, or improved tools. It could also provide prestige, drawing more laborers or allies into the farmstead's orbit. But the risks were real, and many families waited anxiously for men who never returned. In such cases, the longhouse became a site of mourning, with stories offered in memory of the fallen and practical decisions quickly made to ensure the farm's survival. Seen from this perspective, the Viking household emerges not as a backdrop, but as the foundation of the entire Viking world. Every voyage began and ended at the longhouse. Every warrior carried its smells, its warmth, and its expectations with him across the sea. It grounded him in the world, even as he pushed anxiously and bravely beyond it. In the next chapter, we will shift our focus from the interior of the household to the village around it, examining the networks of neighbors' alliances and social bonds that shaped a raider's community long before he ever boarded a ship. If you step outside the longhouse and look across the land, the Viking household reveals itself as only one part of a broader, interconnected village ecosystem. These villages were not urban centers in the way we imagine cities today. Instead, they were clusters of farms, workshops, paths, small docks, meeting places, and sacred spaces woven together through kinship, obligation, and mutual reliance. The Viking world was rural, but never isolated. Even the smallest settlement, tucked along a fjord or nestled in a clearing between forests, was part of a wider social network that shaped every aspect of daily life, including the decisions that sent raiders across the sea. To understand what it meant to be a Viking raider, you must first understand the texture of the community that supported him. Picture a typical village along a Norwegian fjord or Danish coastline. The landscape undulates with hills and rocky outcroppings. Narrow footpaths connect one farm to the next, winding past small clusters of storage sheds, grazing fields, and fenced-off enclosures for animals. Chickens wander freely between properties. The wooden skeleton of a half-repaired boat lies near the shore, surrounded by tools left out to dry. The rhythm of life here is slow, but purposeful. Every household depends on every other, and every person has a role to play. At the heart of this community lies the extended family. Kinship ties define one's obligations, alliances, and expectations in a world where written contracts are rare and trust is built through familiarity. A raider is never simply an individual making his own choices. He is an extension of his family's honor. If he acts poorly abroad, his reputation follows him home like a shadow, affecting the way his kin are perceived. If he succeeds and returns wealthy, the benefits ripple outward, improving the fortunes of relatives and neighbors. Marriage further strengthens these connections. Viking marriage was not merely a private union between two people. It was a negotiation between families. Through marriage, alliances were forged, land was combined or redistributed, and feuds were settled. The social fabric of the village was, in many ways, held together by these strategic bonds. A raider might leave home under the leadership of a chieftain, who was also a cousin by marriage, or a distant uncle whose influence extended through generations. Within this network, neighbors often shared resources. One farm might have a particularly skilled blacksmith, another might own a larger herd of cattle. Instead of viewing these differences as inequalities, communities approached them as opportunities for exchange. A warrior preparing for a voyage might visit a local craftsman not only because the craftsman was talented, but because an unspoken understanding existed. Families supported one another. The raider's success would benefit the village, and the craftsman's work contributed to that shared goal. The village was also bound together by a system of law and governance that balanced individual autonomy with communal responsibility. The Viking world functioned through assemblies known as local gatherings, where disputes were settled. Agreements were made, and justice was administered. These assemblies could occur on grassy hillsides, near sacred trees, or beside stone markers that indicated a place of political importance. A raider returning home, perhaps with spoils or injuries, was still subject to the authority of the thing. If he had wronged someone in the past, the assembly remembered. If he sought to claim new property or settle a dispute, the thing offered structure and legitimacy. Honor, in this context, was more than personal pride. It was the currency that maintained order. To be seen as honorable meant that one's word carried weight, that one's family was respected, and that one could be trusted in trade or conflict. Dishonor, conversely, isolated individuals and eroded relationships. A raider's decision to fight, explore, or plunder did not exist in a vacuum. It carried legal and social implications that resonated long after the voyage ended. In the quieter moments of village life, these connections were reinforced through communal gatherings. Seasonal celebrations marked the turning points of the year: midwinter feasts, harvest festivals, and rituals welcoming the return of spring. These events brought entire communities together, dissolving the boundaries between families for a time. People shared ale, roasted meat, stories, and songs. Children played outside the longhouses, while elders recited sagas. Such gatherings reinforced a collective identity, reminding everyone that they were part of something larger. Trade also flowed through these villages, enriching them culturally and materially. Even before the age of raids, Scandinavians were adept traders. Boats brought goods from other villages: dried fish, furs, amber, iron tools, and textiles. Later, after raiding became more common, wealth in the form of silver, foreign ornaments, and luxury items began to appear more frequently. These goods traveled not simply as currency, but as symbols, reminders that the ripple was broader than the horizon, and that their people had the courage to cross seas in pursuit of opportunity. For young men growing up in this environment, the village was a living classroom. They learned how to farm, how to handle boats, how to solve disputes, and how to conduct themselves with dignity. Boys observed adults negotiating alliances or preparing for voyages, absorbing the unspoken rules that shaped Viking identity. They learned that strength was valuable, but so were patience and cooperation. A raider who acted recklessly endangered not only himself, but everyone connected to him. The village also provided spiritual grounding. Sacred groves, stones, or small shrines to the gods could be found scattered throughout the settlement. Rituals and offerings were performed not only in households but at communal sites. Before embarking on a raid, men often visited these places to seek the favor of deities such as Thor, Odin, or Freya. The gods were woven into every aspect of society, seen not as distant rulers but as present forces influencing weather, harvests, voyages, and battles. In many communities, seers or wise women added another layer of cohesion. These individuals held respected but sometimes feared roles, interpreting omens, offering guidance, and cautioning against actions that might offend supernatural forces. Their presence reinforced the idea that the visible world fields, boats, livestock, kin was only one dimension of existence. The invisible world, populated by gods, spirits, and ancestors, was just as real and influential. All of this, the kinship networks, the legal structures, the spiritual beliefs, and the shared labor created a stable foundation that made the life of a Viking raider possible. When a group of men prepared to leave on a voyage, they did so with the full weight of their community behind them. Their success or failure would echo across farms, marriages, and assemblies. Their actions abroad would reflect on their village, shaping how outsiders perceived the entire community. And when they returned, the village was there to receive them, whether with celebration, quiet relief, or solemn grief. In victory or loss, the web of kinship remained intact, holding the community together as it had done for generations. In the next chapter, we will move from the village to the harbor, exploring how Viking ships were built, stored, and prepared for departure, and how these vessels transformed small coastal communities into gateways to the wider world. Before a Viking raider ever lifted an axe or set foot on a longship, he had to face something far more mysterious than steel or storms: the unseen world. To the people of the north, the world was not divided into real and imagined the way we think today. It was one woven fabric. The wind had moods. The sea had a personality. Ravens carried messages. Dreams warned of danger. And fated quiet, unblinking fate watched from the shadowed corners of every choice. So, before a voyage, Viking communities turned their attention to the forces they believed guided their steps. Some of these beliefs might feel strange to us now, but to them, they were part of the daily landscape, just as essential as rope, food, or weaponry. Let us step into the early morning hours before a raid. Fog hangs low across the fjord, and the longship rocks gently tied to its posts. The raiders gather, not in full armor, but in simple wool and leather, moving slowly, wanting to disturb nothing that might be listening. This is a time of caution, a time when even the boldest warrior tries not to stub his toe or drop his drink, because everyone knows that bad luck loves a dramatic entrance. The first thing many raiders think about is fate itself. The Norns, the mysterious weavers of destiny, were believed to spin and cut the threads of every life. A man could be brave, strong, cunning, and lucky. But if the Norns had already written his death into the cloth of the world, nothing could change it. This belief did not make Vikings fearful. It made them strangely calm. If the end was already planned, then worrying served no purpose. A raider went to sea not because he expected to come home safely, but because facing danger with courage was the only way to live with honor. Still, even calm men liked reassurance. So, before departure, rituals filled the air. Families left small offerings at household altars, bits of food, carved wood, or drops of ale to invite the favor of ancestors and gods. Raiders sometimes carried personal charms, little hammer pendants to call on Thor's strength, carved bone pieces, or bits of cloth tied in knots for protection. These were not fashion statements. They were shields against the invisible. Then came the runes. Ah yes, the runes, those mysterious carved characters everyone now likes to tattoo on their arms without being entirely sure what they mean. In Viking times, runes were serious business. Raiders consulted runecasters, often older women with deep knowledge of symbols and stories. She would cast rune pieces onto a cloth and interpret the way they landed. A good reading brought smiles and confidence. A bad reading made everyone suddenly very interested in rescheduling the raid for, say, next month. Sometimes, the runes gave vague answers good for short-term plans, risky for long-distance voyages. In that case, raiders watched the natural world for signs. If ravens circled overhead in a certain way, it could mean safe winds. If they flew off toward the horizon without looking back, it might suggest danger. Birds were practically the weather reporters of the Viking age, except they could also be spies for Odin, which added a little pressure to their forecasts. Even small events carried meaning. A man tripping on his way to the shore could be taken as a hint from the gods. Dropping a weapon before boarding was worse. No one wanted to start a voyage by feeding chaos with clumsiness. There is even a recorded belief that if someone sneezed just as you were leaving, you were supposed to turn back. A sneeze. Imagine a raider all geared up, ready to cross the sea, only to hear someone sneeze behind him. You can almost picture the group groaning in frustration while the sneezer says, "Sorry, my bad." Life aboard a ship brought its own set of rules. Some were practical. It was bad luck to whistle on a longship, because whistling was believed to call storms. Now, modern sailors might argue this is nonsense, but anyone who has ever been stuck at sea during bad weather can understand the appeal of not tempting fate. No one wanted to wake Thor by making too much noise. Another superstition: never let a woman's name be spoken loudly on a ship. This was not about disrespect. It was about avoiding confusion with the spirits of the sea, especially the powerful, unpredictable forces that controlled waves and storms. The ocean, in Viking imagination, was full of beings just as temperamental as humans, sometimes helpful, sometimes furious for no clear reason. Raiders tried their best not to offend any water spirits, especially while drifting in the middle of their territory. Weather patterns, too, were watched as carefully as enemy fortifications. A sudden, sharp change in wind could be interpreted as a warning. A strange color in the clouds might suggest unseen forces stirring. Even the way waves slapped against the side of the ship could say something to a seasoned sailor. Some men swore they could sense danger long before it arrived, and whether this came from superstition or experience hardly mattered. On a long voyage, anything that helped you stay alive was worth respecting. Dreams also held deep importance. Vikings believed dreams could carry messages from gods or ancestors. Before a raid, if a warrior dreamed of fire, waves, or wolves, he might approach the chieftain privately and say, "Maybe the gods want us to wait." And sometimes, the chieftain listened. Sometimes he didn't. Leadership in the Viking world meant balancing confidence with fear, and knowing when to call off a voyage could be just as heroic as carrying one out. There were also forbidden behaviors. Breaking a taboo at sea could endanger the entire crew, and no one wanted to be the reason Thor got irritated. Men avoided arguing loudly, mocking the gods, or making careless jokes about storms. Even if someone secretly thought the superstitions were silly, they kept that opinion to themselves. Nothing ruined morale faster than the idea that someone had invited bad luck aboard. Yet for all their caution, Vikings weren't ruled by fear. Their relationship with the unseen world was more like an ongoing negotiation. You respect the gods, follow the signs, perform the rituals, and in return, you hope the world treats you fairly. These beliefs gave comfort in a life full of uncertainty. When the sea stretched endlessly around them and the wind howled like a living thing, knowing that powerful forces watched over them helped raiders stay steady. Their superstitions also strengthened bonds within the crew. When everyone shared the same rituals, fears, and hopes, it created unity. Preparing for a voyage wasn't just about sharpening blades or loading supplies. It was about aligning hearts and minds, making sure everyone stepped onto the ship believing the same things and expecting the same outcome. And when the omens were good, when the runes promised success, and when the morning breeze carried the smell of open water, raiders felt ready. Not because they trusted their weapons more than their enemies, but because they believed the unseen world had opened a path for them. In the next chapter, we'll step into the practical side of this preparation, gathering warriors, stocking ships, and planning raids, because even with all the superstitions in the world, no Viking raid ever succeeded without sharp logistics and sharper teamwork. Long before a longship touched foreign shores, long before blades clanged or treasure changed hands, a Viking raid began as something far more ordinary, a plan whispered across a table, a quiet agreement between men who had known each other since childhood, and a long list of chores that absolutely no one wanted to forget. Preparing for a raid was not simply a matter of gathering weapons and shouting "Let us go." The real work happened weeks, sometimes months before anyone pushed a longship into the fjord. And the surprising thing is that this early stage was less about blood and battle and more about organization, negotiation, and teamwork. Not exactly the dramatic image people imagine, but very much the reality. Everything began with a leader, usually a chieftain, seasoned farmer warrior, or respected sailor who decided it was time to venture abroad. Maybe he heard rumors of a wealthy monastery on a distant coast. Maybe a merchant brought news of a vulnerable settlement with silver tucked away in storage. Maybe the chieftain's neighbors had been bragging too loudly about their last raid, and pride demanded a new accomplishment. Whatever the reason, someone had to step forward and say, "We should sail." But saying it and doing it were different matters. The chieftain would first gather a few trusted men in private, often inside a longhouse lit only by firelight. Maps, if you could call them, that were laid out. These were less maps in the modern sense and more scribbled memory guides, rough lines showing coasts, landmarks, rivers, hazards, and previous landing points. Much of Viking navigation relied on what you could remember, so having the crew's experts together was essential. After agreeing on a target and a time frame, the chieftain faced the first major challenge: assembling a crew. You could not just grab anyone wandering by. A raid required men who could row for hours, haul gear, take orders, stay calm in storms, and avoid starting arguments during long stretches of boredom. Also, ideally, they were not the type to snore loudly in a cramped ship, though this qualification was often ignored. Recruitment happened through personal networks. A father might encourage his son to join. Brothers rallied cousins. Wealthier landowners contributed trusted men who owed them service. Young men eager for adventure pushed their way into the lists. Some people joined for silver, some for honor, some simply because staying home to shovel manure felt less appealing than facing a monastery guard with a big axe. Of course, before anyone fully committed, they always asked the most important question: who else is going? A good crew meant smooth teamwork. A bad crew meant trouble, especially if two men with long-standing grudges ended up sitting side by side on rowing benches for 2 weeks. Chieftains were well aware of these tensions. Many deliberately placed feuding men far apart, ideally separated by a few quiet souls who excelled at ignoring drama. Once the crew took shape, the next step was oath-taking. These ceremonies could be solemn or simple, depending on the leader. Men stood around the chieftain, sometimes with their hands on a sword or a sacred object, and swore loyalty for the duration of the voyage. They promised to follow orders, share risks, and divide loot fairly. Breaking these promises was unthinkable. It risked not only the anger of the crew, but the attention of the gods. With oaths made, the planning shifted to the practical side, perhaps the least glamorous but most critical part of the entire operation. Food had to be gathered: hard bread, dried fish, smoked meat, butter sealed in animal skins, and barrels of ale or water all had to be prepared and loaded. The loadout looked more like a mobile picnic than a warrior's arsenal. Without enough food, even the bravest raiders became grumpy, and grumpy raiders made terrible sailors. Tools were just as important as weapons. You needed spare rope, tar for waterproofing, wooden planks for repairs, chisels, axes for cutting timber, fire-starting kits, fishing gear, and buckets, lots of buckets. Buckets were the secret heroes of every voyage. Without them, the ship filled with water faster than anyone liked to admit. Weapons came next. Spears were sharpened, shields repaired, axes checked for cracks in the handle. Some men brought personal swords passed down through generations, precious heirlooms no one wanted to lose. Others carried more modest blades with nicks and scratches that told their own stories. The chieftain inspected everything. A sloppy weapon was a sign of a sloppy warrior, and sloppy warriors were liabilities. Then there was scouting. Contrary to the belief that Vikings wandered blindly into foreign lands, many raids were based on information gathered through trade routes. Traders who traveled far brought back news: which villages were wealthy, which monasteries poorly defended, which kings distracted by other wars. Some chieftains even sent spies or messengers ahead of time. In the north, knowledge was as valuable as a sharpened axe. Alliances had to be considered. One chieftain might join forces with another for a larger expedition. This meant negotiating leadership roles, splitting responsibilities, and most delicate of all, deciding how the loot would be divided if all went well. These talks could stretch late into the night, with careful words and cautious smiles. No one wanted to insult a potential ally, but no one wanted to be cheated either. And hovering over all of this were the rituals. Even after good omens were read, raiders repeated small blessings as departure approached. Some families tied protective knots into clothing. Others carved fresh runes into the ship's mast. The chieftain might pour ale onto the earth as a final offering, asking for safe winds and fortune. Every action, no matter how tiny, felt like a protective layer against the unknown. At last, everything was ready. Supplies packed, weapons slinged, alliances confirmed. The crew had said goodbye to families and given final instructions about farms and livestock. The longship sat prepared, its hull gleaming with fresh tar, its sail folded neatly, its ropes coiled like sleeping snakes. And then, perhaps the most human part of all, waiting. Sometimes the wind was wrong. Sometimes fog rolled in and refused to leave. Sometimes a last-minute dream or omen made the chieftain hesitate. During these pauses, men wandered about, sharpening blades that were already sharp, checking food bags for the 20th time, or telling the same jokes over and over, because everyone was too restless to sit silent. But when the moment came when the wind shifted, the omens held steady, and the tide pulled just right, the atmosphere changed instantly. The longship slid into the water with a soft hiss. Men took their places. The chieftain looked ahead, and with a deep breath of cold northern air, the raid officially began. In the next chapter, we will follow these men as the voyage unfolds through monotony, hardship, storms, laughter, and the long, patient endurance of life at sea. When the seas stiffened into slate-grey stillness, and the winds coming off the Arctic felt like knives rather than gusts, the rhythm of the Viking world changed. Raiding, trading, and long-distance voyaging were endeavors of warmer seasons, but in winter deep, lingering winter life slowed into a patient, almost meditative cadence. This chapter explores that season of endurance. The winter camps built on foreign shores, the longhouses flickering with smoke and warmth back home, and the quiet moments when Vikings, so often imagined as perpetual warriors, simply waited for the earth to unfurl itself again. Winter was not merely a time of cold. It was a season steeped in symbolism, mystery, and ritual. For many Norse families, the year felt divided into two emotional landscapes: the bright seasons of action and the dark season of contemplation. And so, as we drift into this quiet chapter, imagine the world narrowing into a pool of firelight, the snow thickening against the walls, and the long, slow breathing of people learning to live with darkness. The winter longhouse, a warm world in a cold land. Viking longhouses were not only homes, they were fortresses of warmth, built to hold entire communities of memory and routine through the cold months. These structures, long, slightly curved, sheltering like the ribs of a ship, were built of timber, turf, or even stone, depending on local geography. Their thick walls trapped heat. Their roofs, layered with sod or thatch, held snow like a blanket. Inside, benches lined the walls, covered with furs. The central hearth, the heart of the home, burned almost constantly. Families slept, worked, ate, told stories, argued, reconciled, and drifted into dreams beneath the creaking rafters. Livestock, especially in severe winters, might be housed at one end of the building, their warm breath mixing with human warmth, their slow movements a reminder that life continued even in the coldest months. For all their reputation as seafarers, Vikings spent most of their lives in these communal spaces, especially during winter. Life was lived up close. Parents, children, servants, and thralls moving around one another, negotiating tasks and spaces. Children played with wooden toys near the fire. Women wove or spun wool. Men carved tools, fletched arrows, or repaired shields. Boredom lingered, occasionally, but so did intimacy, a closeness that summer voyages would soon break apart again. Winter camps abroad, shelters on foreign shores. Not all winters were spent at home. Raiders caught far from Scandinavia when the cold set in had to build temporary camps, sometimes staying through the entire winter season. Along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Frankish territory, they created fortified settlements called longforts, encampments that functioned as both military bases and overwintering stations. These camps were often constructed quickly, using timber from the nearby land. The Vikings would anchor their longships in rivers or sheltered bays, erect defensive walls, and build makeshift longhouses or huts. They hunted, fished, traded, and raided opportunistically when weather permitted. Winter, though slower, did not mean inactivity. Within these camps, life blended survival and strategy. Leaders held councils near the fire, planning the next season's ambitions. Young warriors trained, tossing spears into snowdrifts, or sparring with wooden shields to keep their muscles ready. Blacksmiths repaired weapons dulled by autumn raids, and in the darkest nights, when wind howled against canvas and timber, men whispered sagas to remind one another of home. Winter camps could be dangerous. Supplies were scarce. Local kingdoms sometimes launched counterattacks. Sickness traveled fast in tight quarters, but these camp staff, crude, determined, allowed Viking fleets to maintain a constant presence abroad, preparing for fresh campaigns when spring returned. The long darkness, psychological geography of Viking winters for modern listeners. The idea of months of dim light, or even near total darkness, can feel unimaginable. For the Norse, it was simply the world they inhabited, but that did not mean it left them unchanged. Winter shaped the Viking mindset. It encouraged introspection, storycraft, superstition, and shared memory. Oral storytelling rose to its greatest importance in these months, when the absence of sunlight created a natural stage for imagination. Sagas, myths, and legends took on a kind of heightened reality. Warriors who had seen battle added their tales to the long tapestry of oral history, retelling raids, voyages, and distant wonders. Fear, too, had its place. The Norse believed winter nights were thick with spirits. Draugr restless undead wandered through imaginations like cold drafts through the longhouse door. Trolls, giants, and land spirits were said to roam more freely in the dark season, when the boundary between human settlements and the wilderness seemed thinner and more vulnerable. Thus, winter was not only a test of physical endurance, but spiritual attentiveness. People listened for signs. They made offerings. They avoided certain paths or forests. They performed rituals to protect the home from wandering spirits, knowing the long darkness was not empty. Food, rationing, and the work of survival. Winter meals were simpler, but often heartier. Vikings relied heavily on the food preserved from summer and autumn-dried fish, salted meat, butter sealed in barrels, smoked lamb, root vegetables stored in cool pits, and grains kept for porridge or bread. Rationing was critical. A single miscalculation in autumn could mean hunger in February. Families tracked stores carefully, and the winter communal mindset grew from this shared reliance. No matter how fierce a warrior had been in battle season, winter equalized everyone. Hunger humbled even the strongest. Still, winter meals were moments of warmth. Bread baked on hearthstones, broth simmered slowly, mead, if any was left, warmed the throat. The longhouse filled with the smell of wood smoke and stew, and people gathered shoulder to shoulder against the cold pressing outside. Work and craft, a season of quiet productivity. Though travel slowed, work did not. Winter was the season when Vikings caught up on the endless crafts that sustained their world. Farmers repaired tools and harnesses. Shipbuilders shaped planks or carved pegs for future vessels. Women wove cloth for clothing and sails alike, their rhythmic pulling of the loom echoing across the longhouse. Wood carving, metalwork, leatherwork, and bone carving all flourished in winter. Gifts were crafted, trinkets took shape. Some of the most beautiful Viking artifacts, intricate brooches, carved combs, inlaid drinking horns, were born in winter months, when hands sought activity in the quiet. Art, in a sense, was a strategy of survival. It kept minds focused, spirits lifted, and communities working together through a season that demanded patience above all, the hope of returning light. And then, gradually, winter loosened its grip. Daylight stretched by minutes, then by hours. Snow softened, ice broke. The world exhaled. The Vikings did not greet this simply as a change in weather. It was a spiritual shift. Festivals marked the return of light. New plans unfurled. Longships were hauled from their winter shelters and inspected. Young men sharpened swords and tested shields. Farmers surveyed the fields. Women prepared supplies for the journeys ahead. Winter, in its deep quiet, had prepared them. Now the cycle of light began again, and the Viking world would soon awaken into movement. If you picture a Viking warrior stepping off a longship, axe in hand and shield strapped across his chest, you might imagine him as a creature of pure practicality, decisive, fearless, untroubled by doubts. But beneath that outward hardness lived a mind steeped in ritual, superstition, and a world where every tree, stone, and shoreline carried meaning. The Vikings navigated their lives not only by wind and tide, but by the invisible systems of omen and tradition that shaped their understanding of fate. This chapter explores the deeply spiritual landscape under the surface of Viking culture, a landscape where gods walked the world, where magic had weight, and where the future was as fragile as a raven's whisper. Living in a world filled with spirits. For the Norse, the world was never empty. Everything around them held a spirit or essence, what they called Viking. These spirits could inhabit forests, rocks, rivers, and mountains, and they demanded a certain respect. A traveler who passed a sacred grove might leave an offering, a coin, a carved figure, a splash of ale. Ignoring these customs could invite misfortune, illness, or bad weather. Respecting them, however, could turn a journey from perilous to promising. This worldview made everyday life feel connected to unseen forces. A farmer approaching a marsh knew it was home to land spirits. A sailor staring at the horizon might believe a sea spirit followed their wake. Children learned early that the world was delicate, interconnected, and full of consequences. Thus, when Vikings prepared for voyages or raids, they did not rely solely on human skill. They asked permission from the world itself. The role of the gods in daily The Norse gods were not distant, unreachable beings. They were companions, guides, and sometimes stern judges. People spoke to them in small gestures, raising a cup to Odin before a journey, leaving bread for Thor before a storm, whispering thanks to Freya for a good harvest. Odin, god of wisdom, poetry, and the dead, loomed large in the lives of warriors. His ravens, Hugin and Munin thought and memory, were believed to watch the world each morning and return messages of what they saw. When actual ravens circled a campsite or perched on a mast, men watched them with quiet intensity. A raven flying east might be a sign of good fortune. A raven flying west could mean something darker. Thor, on the other hand, was a protector of homes, travelers, and sailors alike. His hammer symbol, Mjolnir, was worn as a talisman, not as decoration but as a shield against chaos. A man setting out to sea might touch his hammer pendant twice for luck. A pregnant woman might keep one near her bed for protection. Freya, god of fertility and prosperity, was honored for good harvests, good weather, and good fortune. And Freya, with her associations to both love and battle, was invoked by warriors who sought a beautiful death, one that ensured their soul would be welcomed into one of the afterlife realms. These gods, woven into the fabric of life, shaped Viking decisions as surely as any chieftain or law. Rituals before voyages, preparing for fate before embarking on a raid or long voyage. Rituals played a central role in calming anxieties, seeking guidance, and establishing a sense of cosmic order. Many chieftains consulted Volvas prophetesses skilled in seer, the Norse magical tradition of seeing the future and shaping fate. Wrapped in cloaks of fur and adorned with staffs carved with runes, these women would enter trance-like states, chanting, rocking, and calling upon spirits for insight. Their words could influence strategy, timing, or the entire course of an expedition. If the Volva saw misfortune, a chieftain might delay a departure, change direction, or even abandon a plan entirely. Animal sacrifices also held an important function. A goat, horse, or cattle might be offered to the gods, with the blood collected carefully in bowls and sprinkled around the ceremonial site. The patterns in the blood, the behavior of the animals before slaughter, or the way fire consumed the offering might all be interpreted as signs. These rituals were not merely symbolic, they were pragmatic acts of communication with the divine. Even small gestures mattered. Some raiders carried lucky charms carved from bone or wood. Others wore the claws of an animal they believed guided them. A young warrior might take a token from home, a stone, a feather, a small carved figure to remind him of the world he was defending. Reading the natural world, omens as guides to the Vikings. Nature itself spoke in a language of signs. Wind direction at dawn could indicate a favorable or treacherous journey. A sudden stillness in the air could be interpreted as the presence of spirits. The pattern of waves against a hull might signal the mood of the sea gods. Birds held special significance. Ravens, eagles, swans, and even small sparrows might carry messages. Warriors learned to watch their flights, their calls, their formations. A raven perched on a long ship's prow was seen as Odin's favor. 3 gulls circling overhead might symbolize safe passage. But a bird crashing into a ship's sail or landing near the hearth in a longhouse that was almost always seen as a warning. Dreams too were treated with seriousness. A dream of falling could mean a journey would be lost. A dream of fire might mean conflict. A dream of an ancestor smiling or speaking could signal protection. The morning after such dreams, discussions in the longhouse were long and careful. Magic, curses, and the fear of the unknown magic elder. Spells sung into being was not the domain of fantasy, but an accepted part of the Viking world. Warriors sometimes believed they could be cursed by rivals or defended by charms placed under beds or carved into weapon handles. Young men would whisper protective spells while tracing runes across their shields. Mothers sang Vadlaku guardian songs to infants on stormy nights. The fear of malevolent magic ran alongside the fear of winter spirits, wandering Draugr, and hostile Landvitter. Vikings protected themselves with rituals, but they also respected boundaries. Certain hills, gravesites, and forests were avoided, especially during seasonal transitions when the line between the living and the dead felt thin. Seasonal rituals, marking the cycle of life as the seasons turned, so did the Vikings' spiritual calendar. Festivals such as Jael, the winter solstice, celebration of rebirth and returning light, BLTs, sacrificial festivals honoring gods and spirits, Disablat, honoring female ancestral spirits, all gave structure to the year. These were communal moments when families gathered, when stories were shared, and when the walls between past and present seemed to soften. They helped people make sense of time, loss, and the unpredictable nature of life. A culture of fate and freedom above all. The Vikings lived with a deep belief in word fate, woven by the Norns at the roots of Yggdrasil. One's path was shaped by destiny, but human action still mattered. Courage, generosity, honor, and bravery could influence the story one left behind. In this way, the Viking worldview was both fatalistic and empowering. Death was inevitable, but glory was optional. The gods might shape the world, but humans could shape their legacy. And so, when a Viking lifted his face to the wind and studied the sky, he did not simply see weather. He saw the shimmering fabric of fate itself, thin, delicate, ready to tear or to guide. The longship slides silently over the water, its oaken hull cutting through the cold northern morning like a knife through fog. The oars dip in unison, a rhythm so quiet and steady that even the gulls seem hesitant to interrupt it. For a moment, the men on board are sailors, bound to the tide and the wind, listening to the creak of wood, the slap of waves, and the whispers of fate. And then, as land emerges on the horizon, they shift from sailors to warriors. This chapter explores that delicate, tension-filled transition, the slow, measured reality of conducting a Viking raid, far from the myths of endless bloodshed and roaring battle. Raiding was not chaos. It was a carefully orchestrated, if fast-moving, operation. Surprise was everything. Viking leaders understood that a small force, organized and swift, could accomplish more than a larger army lumbering overland. That meant approaching quietly, often before dawn, using fog, tide, or natural cover to conceal movement. There was no glory in announcing arrival with a cheer or a horn. The first goal was efficiency. Get ashore, strike, take what was valuable, and retreat before defenders could respond effectively. Landing and initial formations as the keel scrapes the shore and the first boots touch sand or mud. The raiders assume a formation that is deceptively simple. Shields are raised, spears gripped, and axes ready. Men with experience position themselves near the front, ready to absorb or deflect the first rush of defenders. Behind them, younger warriors carry supplies, ready to secure loot. Archers or spear throwers find vantage points, if the terrain allows, to cover flanks or block escape routes. Each step is deliberate. Panic is dangerous. Discipline, even in the heat of an ambush, can mean the difference between success and disaster. Raids often targeted monasteries, storehouses, and coastal villages. These places were rich in goods and often lightly defended. Raiders aimed to move quickly, striking while defenders were disoriented, securing valuables and avoiding drawn-out battles. Long fights were rare. Vikings were practical. Death was inevitable, and wasting it unnecessarily made no sense. The physical and mental demands, even for experienced raiders. Raids were physically exhausting. Men ran over uneven terrain carrying weapons and heavy packs. Sweat mixed with grime. Rain and wind made footing treacherous. Eyes scanned constantly for danger. Muscles screamed. Hearts pounded. But the rhythm of the raid demanded focus. There was no room for distraction. Even a small misstep could lead to injury, loss, or death. Mentally, raids were just as taxing. The sudden shift from calm voyaging to acute awareness triggered stress that had to be managed. Raiders relied on training, instinct, and a deep trust in their comrades. Humor sometimes lightened the tension. A whispered joke or a playful shove could ease nerves, even for a moment. But beneath the laughter was a constant hum of attention, an awareness that any miscalculation could have consequences far beyond the moment. Loot, captives, and negotiation. Loot was the ultimate goal. but raiders knew it could take many forms. Silver, gold, jewelry, livestock, or grain were all valuable, often traded or melted down later. Monasteries, with their combination of wealth and minimal defenses, were prime targets. Raiders respected the practicality of efficiency. Take what you can carry, destroy what you cannot, and avoid unnecessary complications. Captives were also part of the strategy. Slaves known as thralls were valuable for labor or for sale. Children, artisans, or anyone deemed useful might be taken rather than killed. However, raiders rarely lingered to make moral judgments. Decisions were made quickly and pragmatically. Occasionally, ransoms were negotiated for higher value captives. This practice, oddly businesslike amid the chaos, reinforced the notion that Viking raiding was not random savagery, but a calculated blend of opportunity, risk, and economic reasoning. The reality versus the myth. While popular imagination paints raids as continuous, cinematic battles, the truth was different. Many raids were over before anyone realized they had begun. Often, raiders would strike, gather resources, and withdraw within hours. Sometimes, there were no victims left alive. Sometimes, defenders managed to resist successfully. The raiders' success depended on timing, observation, and careful planning skills honed over years, often taught from boyhood. Casualties, while not romanticized, were real. Wounds, broken bones, and exhaustion were constant companions. Raiders performed quick assessments: who could move, who needed help, and what resources could be spared to aid the injured without slowing the mission. This practicality kept the group alive more than brute strength ever could. Rituals in the midst of violence, even during raids. Vikings observed small rituals. A prayer might be whispered over a newly taken sword. An offering to Odin could be left on a threshold before departing. Some men touched protective charms while surveying a raided hall. These actions, often invisible to outsiders, maintained a sense of order and connection to the unseen world, even amid chaos. It is easy to forget that these men lived their beliefs consistently. The supernatural was never compartmentalized from the practical. Success in the material world was intertwined with favor in the spiritual one. In some ways, rituals helped control anxiety, offering a small measure of certainty in an inherently unpredictable environment. Returning to the ships once the raid concluded, the crew reconvened at the landing site, loading goods onto the longship with care. Time remained critical. Lingering increased the risk of counterattack. Men checked weapons, tended minor wounds, and reinforced morale. The longship, so central to Viking identity, provided both protection and mobility. Retreat was not shameful, it was a tactical choice that preserved life and ensured future raids. At sea, the raiders' work was far from over. Loot had to be secured, food and water shared equitably, watch rotations established. Every action aboard a longship was designed to maintain discipline and cohesion. The return journey was part of the raid's calculus, and survival depended on planning as much as on luck or strength. The quiet aftermath, after the adrenaline subsided, the first moments on shore were often reflective. Raiders counted their gains, attended to the injured, and offered thanks or small sacrifices to the gods. There was sometimes laughter at mistakes, muttered curses at missteps, and quiet acknowledgement of those lost or injured. The reality of a raid was a balance between achievement and loss, risk and reward, chaos and careful planning. It is in this combination of courage, calculation, and superstition that the Viking raid becomes fully understandable as mindless violence, but as an intricate dance of preparation, execution, and human endurance. The echo of the raid lingers in the air long after the last oar has left the shore. Dust settles over fields that were once trampled. Smoke drifts lazily from burned or looted buildings. The distant cries of startled animals fade into silence. For a moment, the world seems suspended, poised between the past, the violence that has just occurred on the uncertain horizon ahead. This is the space that Vikings knew intimately. The quiet, raw, reflective aftermath of a raid, where survival, grief, and ritual intersected. It is tempting to imagine that raiders returned immediately to the comfort of their longships or homes, but the reality was slower, quieter, and more contemplative. Men tended wounds, assessed losses, and repaired gear before they even thought about departure. Blood dried on weapons and hands. The smell of iron and smoke clung to their clothes. Even the most hardened warriors needed time to process the sudden mixture of adrenaline, relief, and sorrow that followed a violent encounter. Caring for the injured and the fallen first, the wounded received attention. Cuts were cleaned as best as possible with water and ash, and broken bones were stabilized with splints. Experienced raiders knew which injuries could be managed and which required immediate attention, often improvising with materials on hand. There was little luxury, no room for prolonged treatment, yet there was an unmistakable care in these actions. The survival of each man mattered not only for personal bonds, but for the cohesion of the crew. Every life preserved was a thread in the tightly woven fabric of Viking identity. Honoring the dead was equally crucial. Those lost in the raid were often remembered in small, private rituals: a dropped piece of silver, a whispered prayer, or the placement of a weapon across a fallen comrade. These gestures acknowledged the boundary between life and death, ensuring that even in their absence, the dead remained part of the community's story. Sometimes, stories of their bravery were quietly recounted, tales that would eventually find their way into sagas. Even in the immediacy of survival, Vikings preserved memory, managing plunder and disputes after attending to life and death. Raiders turned to the more pragmatic side of the aftermath, the division of spoils. Loot could include silver coins, jewelry, tools, livestock, or captured slaves. The distribution was not left to chance. Agreements made before the raid, oaths taken by the crew, and the chieftain's authority guided the process. Yet disagreements were not uncommon. A man who had fought bravely might feel entitled to more, while another, perhaps more strategic, claimed credit for clever planning. Disputes were settled through discussion, sometimes heated but usually tempered by the awareness that disharmony could jeopardize the journey home. Harmony, like speed, was essential. Interestingly, these negotiations reflected the Viking understanding of fairness and honor. Raiding was not a lawless enterprise. It operated within a framework of expectation, reputation, and social rules. A man who cheated his comrades risked more than punishment. He risked ostracism, a mark on his family, and the judgment of the gods. Order, even after chaos, was a guiding principle. Psychological and emotional recovery. The psychological toll of raiding was real, though often overlooked. Moments of reflection arose quietly, staring at the horizon, listening to the slap of water against the hull, or sitting beside a flickering fire. Memories of violence mingled with relief at survival. Laughter might break the tension, often at the expense of someone else's minor mistake, because humor, even dark humor, lightened the burden of shared trauma. Silent moments of grief were equally present, sometimes expressed through whispered prayers or the tightening of a jaw against tears. Even hardened warriors experienced the weight of witnessing death and destruction. They understood that survival came at a cost. That bravery was measured not only by the ability to strike, but by the ability to endure what came after. Preparing to leave, rituals and precautions. Once wounds were tended, disputes settled, and the initial grief acknowledged, attention turned to departure. The longship, now loaded with goods and sometimes captives, required careful preparation. Sailors checked rigging, repaired minor damage, and distributed weight evenly. Food and water were rationed. Weapons were inspected one last time. Men ensured that nothing unnecessary would slow the ship's glide through the water. Rituals continued even in these practical moments. Raiders might offer thanks to the gods for survival and success. A coin might be left in the sand, a drink poured over the hull, a charm touched for luck. These small acts maintained continuity between the human and the divine, reinforcing the idea that their lives were entwined with forces beyond comprehension. The psychological shift from land back to sea was subtle but significant. Men moved from warriors in a hostile environment to sailors navigating unpredictable waters. It was a liminal moment between one world and the next, between violence and calm, between mortality and survival. The longship itself became both protector and boundary, a space where the crew's cohesion, discipline, and ritualized behavior ensured they could return home. The journey back, silence and reflection. As the longship glided away from the coast, the sounds of the raid faded. The rhythmic dip of oars replaced the chaos of land. Men spoke in quiet tones, shared small morsels of food, and sometimes hummed songs to break the silence. This period was less about celebration and more about endurance, reflection, and reconnection with self and crew. The sea, expansive and indifferent, mirrored the internal landscape of the raiders. Waves reminded them of the world's unpredictability. Wind shifted, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, requiring constant attention. Sleep was brief and broken, but necessary. The long voyage home was as much about maintaining focus, morale, and balance as it was about returning with plunder, returning to community and memory. Even as the voyage continued, raiders carried the weight of the aftermath with them. Thoughts of the lost, the wounded, the distant village they had left behind, and the rituals they had observed all lingered. The boundary between life and death, between human action and divine influence, remained present. And when land finally appeared in the distance, the anticipation of homecoming mingled with reflection. What they had done, what they had taken, and what they had lost would soon become stories, memories, and lessons to carry forward. The aftermath of a raid was, in many ways, the quietest, most human part of the experience. It was a space for tending bodies, minds, and spirits, a bridge between violent action and the return to routine life. Here, the Viking raider was at once a warrior, a caretaker, a participant in ritual, and a human being absorbing the consequences of choices made in the fog of adrenaline and courage. The longship glides silently into the fjord, the familiar coastline rising from the cold northern water like a welcome sight in a dream. Smoke curls from chimneys. Children run along the shore, eyes wide with curiosity. Livestock stir in their pens, and in the center of it all, the returning raiders feel the mixture of relief, pride, and anticipation that has been building since they first touched foreign sand weeks saw, even months ago. Homecoming, in the Viking world, was not merely the end of a journey. It was a ceremony, a judgment, and a continuation of the story begun long before the first oar left the harbor. Arrival and initial observations landing was deliberate and measured. Men disembarked slowly, weapons sheathed, but ready. Eyes scanned the horizon and the village for any unexpected surprise. Neighbors, rival chieftains, or curious strangers. The longship, carefully guided onto the beach, became a stage for performance as much as utility. Raiders walked ashore, carrying treasures, loot, and sometimes captives, while villagers' friends, relatives, and those left behind watched with a mix of excitement, relief, and, occasionally, awe. Families often ran to greet those returning, bringing food, blankets, or even the small comforts of home. These moments, though seemingly mundane, were deeply emotional. A father saw his son again, a brother embraced a sibling, and women who had kept the hearth burning through the long absence shared quiet smiles and tears. In Viking culture, the long months away were never ignored. Their impact was acknowledged through gestures of care, celebration, and ritual. Distribution of loot and its social implications. Once home, the division of plunder became central. Wealth obtained abroad was not simply pocketed individually. It reinforced social bonds, obligations, and hierarchies. A chieftain might claim a larger share, justified by leadership and strategic skill. Warriors received portions according to rank, role, and personal contribution. Slaves, livestock, and portable goods were allocated with careful attention to fairness, or, at least, to perceived fairness. The distribution was about more than material gain. It solidified reputations. A man known to divide loot generously, respecting the rules, earned trust and influence. A man who hoarded or cheated risked losing status, damaging alliances, and even inviting divine disfavor. In this way, raiding reinforced not only wealth, but the moral economy of the Viking community. Honor, reputation, and generosity were as valuable as silver. Transformation of households and alliances. The arrival of wealth reshaped daily life. Longhouses, once modest, might be repaired or expanded. Food reserves grew, livestock multiplied. Tradespeople could buy better tools, sails, or household goods. Marriages, betrothals, and alliances were influenced by the social elevation brought by a successful raid. Wealth could cement a chieftain's authority, make a family more attractive for political or economic partnerships, and allow young warriors to marry well. Beyond individual households, raids impacted the wider community. Elders, neighbors, and distant kin observed who had succeeded and who had failed. Status, once earned through bravery and skill, was now tangible, codified in silver, grain, or captives. The narrative of the raid became part of local memory, retold at feasts and gatherings, where stories, humor, and exaggeration mixed with truth to create enduring sagas. Psychological adjustment after violence. Returning home was not always purely joyous. The raid's dangers, its bloodshed, its stress left impressions that required adjustment. Warriors processed injuries, witnessed losses, and reconciled actions taken abroad with life back on familiar soil. Even the most hardened raider experienced tension, the need to resume peaceful routines, care for family and livestock, and navigate social dynamics could be almost as challenging as facing a foreign foe. The long months at sea and the sharp focus of combat left men with altered rhythms of thought and behavior. Laughter, storytelling, and communal work helped reintegrate them, providing structure and comfort. Some men quietly carried memories they would not speak of, while others shared tales, weaving personal experiences into the broader tapestry of Viking oral history. This delicate balance between recollection and reintegration defined much of the homecoming experience. Ceremonial recognition and rituals, certain acts of recognition accompanied return. Chieftains might host feasts celebrating victory, honoring both human and divine assistance. Offerings to gods, spirits, and ancestors acknowledged survival and success. Weapons might be cleaned, repaired, or consecrated, returning them to a state of readiness while respecting the rituals surrounding their use. Even simple gestures, placing a token of loot on the family altar, recounting events beside the hearth, reinforced the sacred and social dimensions of the homecoming. Such rituals also served as psychological transitions. Men shifted from raiders back to villagers, from agents of violence to community members. The axe, small or large, marked the boundary between danger and domestic life, providing reassurance to both men and families that the cycle of life and work could resume in safety. The long-term impact of reputation, strengthened or diminished by the raid, had lasting consequences. A warrior's name might spread across neighboring communities, enhancing influence, marriage prospects, or trade opportunities. Tales of courage, clever strategy, or generosity during a raid became part of folklore, cited in future gatherings, or referenced when alliances were negotiated. Conversely, failure or dishonor could linger as a quiet stigma, reminding everyone that risk always carried potential cost. In some cases, particularly successful raids could elevate a chieftain's standing to a regional level. Villages might seek protection or alliance, offering tribute or support in exchange for favor. Wealth and reputation became intertwined, forming the foundation of political and economic power in the Viking world. The homecoming, then, was not merely the end of a voyage. It was the beginning of influence, planning, and preparation for future endeavors. Reflection and continuity. Finally, homecoming was a time of reflection. Men and women alike assessed the past season, what worked, what failed, what was learned. Families celebrated survival, mourned losses, and planned for the future. Young men who had proven themselves prepared for further responsibilities, while elders recounted lessons to guide the next generation. Success and failure, life and death, were integrated into memory and myth, ensuring that each homecoming contributed to the ongoing narrative of community, family, and identity. In these ways, the Viking homecoming was far more than a simple return to normal life. It was a complex interplay of wealth, reputation, ritual, and reflection, blending human needs with cultural expectations and spiritual awareness. In that quiet, measured transition from action to domesticity, raiders became neighbors again, warriors became family members, and the cycle of preparation, adventure, and return continued, always shaped by the unpredictable winds of fortune and fate. It is tempting to imagine Vikings solely as raiders, longships gliding through mists, axes flashing in sunlight, silver spilling from hastily plundered chests. Yet, for every raid, there were countless voyagers motivated not by violence but by commerce. Trade was not a secondary activity. It was integral to the Viking way of life, interwoven with social status, exploration, and even the preparation for future raids. Understanding their trading ventures offers a fuller picture of who they were: practical, enterprising, and remarkably interconnected with the wider medieval world. Trade routes across a vast world, Vikings did not confine themselves to northern waters. Their trade networks spanned rivers, seas, and continents. From the icy Baltic to the bustling cities along the Volga, from the fjords of Norway to the streets of Dublin and the markets of Baghdad, their reach was astonishing. Rivers served as highways through dense forests, while coastal navigation allowed access to islands and ports previously unreachable by overland paths. Knowledge of tides, currents, and winds was critical, just as it was for raids. But here it was applied to commerce, often over months-long journeys. Merchants and raiders sometimes blurred the line between trading and raiding. A ship carrying furs might pivot to plunder if an unexpected opportunity arose. or a fleet preparing for a raid might stop to acquire supplies through barter. The flexibility to switch between diplomacy and force was a hallmark of Viking seafaring culture. But fundamentally, trade required patience, negotiation, and a keen sense of value skills, as essential as any sword or shield. Goods and commodities. Vikings carried a wide variety of goods. Furs, particularly from northern regions, were highly prized in southern markets. Amber, harvested from the shores of the Baltic, became jewelry and decorative items across Europe. Metals, tools, and weapons were exchanged for grain, wine, and luxury items. Slaves, often captured in raids or traded from neighboring regions, were considered valuable commodities. Even small trinkets or exotic goods, ivory, glass beads, spices, found eager buyers far from their places of origin. Trade was not one-directional. Vikings exported raw materials and crafted items, and in return imported resources that were scarce at home. Silk from Byzantium, silver coins from distant caliphates, or wine from southern Europe enriched both their households and their cultural imagination. Each transaction, while practical, also reinforced the Vikings' awareness of a wider world, of distant cities, and of other peoples whose lives differed but intersected with their own. Markets, ports, and cultural exchange. Markets were hubs, not just of commerce but of cultural exchange. Traders met other merchants, navigators, and travelers, exchanging stories, techniques, and innovations. Language barriers were often overcome through gestures, symbols, and a shared understanding of value. In these spaces, Vikings absorbed new technologies, ideas about architecture, agricultural techniques, and artistic motifs. A shield boss from the east might inspire local craftsmanship. A coin from Baghdad might circulate as far as the fjords of Norway. Ports were often fortified, not for defense against raiders, but to protect wealth in transit. Some Viking settlements, like Hiddeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden, became renowned trade centers, drawing people from distant lands. Life in these towns was a balance of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural negotiation, less dramatic than a raid, but no less essential to Viking society. The intertwining of trade and raiding. It is tempting to think of raiding and trading as completely separate, but in Viking practice, they were deeply intertwined. Trade routes provided intelligence. A merchant familiar with a foreign settlement might report weaknesses or wealth, indirectly facilitating a raid. Conversely, experience gained through raids, knowledge of tides, enemy settlements, and foreign cultures enhanced trade strategies. Ships used for plunder could carry goods back home. Men skilled in negotiation at markets were also capable of strategic leadership during raids. Flexibility, adaptability, and observational skill unified both endeavors. Economic strategy and social importance. Trading was not just about acquiring goods, it was a strategic social tool. Wealth gained through trade increased social standing, provided resources to support kin, and allowed leaders to maintain loyal followers. Those who mastered trade could influence local politics, broker alliances, and secure marriage prospects. Trade reinforced reputation as effectively as a successful raid. A man known for his cunning and fair dealings might become as respected as a warrior with a decorated axe. Merchants also accumulated practical knowledge that shaped future expeditions. Understanding seasonal winds, river conditions, and market demands allowed leaders to plan voyages with foresight. This knowledge was passed from generation to generation, woven into sagas and oral instruction, creating a legacy of skill that complemented the physical daring of raiding. Human stories within trade. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of Viking trade is its human dimension. Families often accompanied trading expeditions, creating small communities on the move. Women sometimes acted as negotiators or managed household goods. Children observed and learned about foreign customs, languages, and business practices. Traders carried not only goods but stories, songs, and cultural practices, enriching both their home settlements and the distant lands they visited. Humor, patience, and improvisation were as important in a market as on a battlefield. A miscommunication could be resolved with a laugh, a creative exchange, or the careful presentation of a gift. Success in trade required the same balance of observation, judgment, and adaptability that kept raiders alive at sea. In this way, commerce mirrored warfare. Both demanded skill, courage, and awareness of the unseen threads connecting people and places. The legacy of trade. The Viking legacy as traders is enduring. Ports that flourished as trading centers often became long-term settlements, hubs of culture, craft, and learning. Goods carried across seas introduced new ideas, techniques, and aesthetics. Knowledge gained through trade about distant lands, foreign technologies, and human behavior enhanced not only Viking survival but their capacity to influence history in subtle ways. Trade also softened the image of Vikings as mere raiders, revealing them as entrepreneurs, diplomats, and cultural intermediaries. They were people navigating a complex world, balancing risk and reward, violence and negotiation, short-term gain and long-term stability. The stories of raiding and trading, intertwined as they were, give a fuller sense of who Vikings really were. When night settled over a Viking settlement and the fires burned low, the world did not feel empty or silent. It felt watched, not in a threatening way, but in a familiar one, like a presence just beyond the edge of sight. For the Vikings, faith was not confined to temples or ceremonies held on special days. It flowed quietly through everyday life, woven into decisions, habits, fears, and hopes. The cosmos they believed in was alive, layered, and deeply personal. To understand the Viking raider, or farmer, trader, or child, you must first understand how they imagined the universe itself. A universe held together by a tree. At the center of the Viking worldview stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree. Its branches stretched across the heavens, its roots dug deep into realms of gods, giants, and the dead. Everything that existed, humans, gods, monsters, spirits, lived somewhere within this living structure. The universe was not distant or abstract. It was organic, interconnected, and constantly in motion. The 9 worlds were not separate planets, but neighboring realms, sometimes brushing against one another. Midgard, the human world, sat in the middle, vulnerable yet protected. Asgard, home of the gods, hovered above. Below lay Hel, the realm of the dead, not a place of punishment, but of quiet continuation. Beyond these were worlds of fire, ice, giants, and spirits, all influencing the balance of existence. This cosmology shaped how Vikings viewed danger. Storms were not random. Illness was not accidental. Success and failure were the result of unseen forces, nudging events in subtle ways. To live wisely was to live attentively. The gods as companions, not masters. The Norse gods were powerful, but they were not distant or perfect. They argued, failed, laughed, and made mistakes. This made them relatable. Odin, wise and restless, sacrificed an eye for knowledge and wandered the world in disguise. Thor, strong and protective, struggled with anger but defended humanity from chaos. Freya embodied fertility, beauty, and prosperity, while also understanding loss and longing. Vikings did not worship their gods with submission so much as with relationship. They offered gifts, prayers, and sacrifices, but also expected something in return: protection, favorable winds, strength in battle, a good harvest. Faith was transactional, but also deeply respectful. A raider might whisper to Odin before a dangerous landing, not asking to survive forever, but to die well if death came. A farmer might thank Freya for healthy livestock. A mother might ask Frigg to watch over her children. These were quiet conversations with a universe that listened, even if it did not always answer kindly. Rituals, large and small. Some rituals were communal and dramatic. Others were so subtle they barely looked like rituals at all. The BLT was one of the most important communal ceremonies. Animals were sacrificed, their blood collected and sprinkled on people, buildings, and sacred objects. The act was not cruel in the Viking mind. It was necessary. Life was exchanged for life. Balance was restored. The gods were fed so the world could continue. But just as meaningful were the smaller rituals. Touching a hammer pendant before a storm, placing bread near a stone believed to house land spirits, speaking a name softly before entering a forest. These actions anchored people in a universe that felt responsive and alive. Even weapons carried ritual weight. Swords were named. Axes were treated with respect. A blade that had saved a life or taken one might be cleansed, thanked, or laid aside with ceremony. Tools were not objects. They were participants. Magic, runes, and spoken power. Magic was not fantasy, it was technique. Runes were more than letters. They were symbols of power, carved into wood, bone, or metal, to protect, curse, or guide. A simple mark on a ship's mast might be meant to calm the sea. A rune carved into a comb might protect its owner from illness. Words spoken aloud, especially in verse or chant, carried weight. Sound shaped reality. Seer, a form of magic associated with prophecy and fate, was practiced by specialists, often women. It involved trance, chanting, and spirit communication. While powerful, it was also feared. Those who practiced it were respected but kept at a distance, existing between worlds much like the magic they wielded. To live in the Viking world was to accept that unseen forces moved constantly around you and that, with care and knowledge, you might influence them. Death was not an ending. The Viking relationship with death was surprisingly calm. Death was inevitable. What mattered was how it arrived and how one was remembered. A good death, brave, honorable, meaningful, ensured a place in stories, memory, and possibly the afterlife halls of the gods. Valhalla was not heaven. It was a place of preparation, where fallen warriors trained for Ragnarok, the final battle that would end the world. Not everyone went to Valhalla, and that was fine. Many went to Hell, a quiet realm ruled by the goddess Hel, where ancestors continued to exist in a subdued reflection of life. Burial rituals mattered deeply because they ensured the dead transitioned correctly. Grave goods were not offerings of wealth, they were tools for the next stage of existence. Ship burials, mound graves, and cremations all reflected this belief. Death was a journey, not a disappearance. Fate, choice, and the weaving of time. At the deepest level of Viking belief lay the Norns, three beings who wove the threads of fate. Past, present, and future were not fixed lines, but threads intertwined. A person could not escape fate, but they could face it with courage. This belief shaped Viking psychology. Fear existed, but it did not dominate. Since death would come when it was meant to come, action mattered more than avoidance. Bravery was not recklessness, he was alignment with destiny. This worldview gave raiders the ability to step into uncertainty with steady resolve. They did not believe they were invincible. They believed they were already written into the story. Faith as comfort in an uncertain world. Above all, faith offered comfort. It softened the fear of storms, loss, and violence. It gave meaning to suffering and structure to chaos. It reminded people that they were part of something vast, ancient, and ongoing. Whether staring into firelight or into the endless sea, Vikings felt accompanied. Their gods would fall one day. Their world would end. But until then, there was work to do, stories to tell, and lives to live with honor. In the next chapter, we will step back from belief and look forward in time toward what remained after the Viking Age faded, and how the spirit of the raider quietly shaped the world that followed. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle, a final voyage, or the quiet rotting of longships pulled onto forgotten shores. It faded slowly, like mist lifting from the sea at morning. By the late 11th century, raids grew less frequent. Christianity spread across Scandinavia. Kings replaced chieftains, laws replaced blood feuds. And yet, something essential remained. The Viking spirit did not vanish, changed shape. This chapter is not about endings, but about transformation. About how the lives, values, and habits of Viking raiders continued long after the last raid was sung about. From raiders to settlers, many Vikings did not return home at all. They stayed in places like Iceland, Greenland, Normandy, and the British Isles. Raiders became farmers, lawmakers, and community builders. The same men who once leapt from longships with shields raised now measured fields, built homes, and negotiated land boundaries. Violence gave way to permanence. In Iceland, Viking settlers created one of the world's earliest parliamentary systems. The Alhingiware disputes were settled through law and debate rather than axes and bloodshed. Honor still mattered, but it was now expressed through words, reputation, and legal standing. The skills that once organized raids' leadership, negotiation, memory, and storytelling found new use in governance. Normandy tells a similar story. Vikings who once terrorized Frankish coasts were eventually granted land, intermarried, adopted local customs, and became the Normans. Their descendants would later reshape Europe again, most famously in 1066. The raider became ruler without ever fully losing his edge. Craft, exploration, and innovation. The Viking legacy also survived through craftsmanship and exploration. Their shipbuilding techniques influenced naval design for centuries. The clinker-built hull, flexible and resilient, allowed travel across both rivers and open oceans. Their navigational knowledge based on stars, winds, birds, and memory expanded the known world long before maps caught up. Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. They traded across continents. They mapped coastlines not on parchment, but in the mind. Even as raiding declined, exploration did not. Curiosity remained. Art and craftsmanship endured as well. Viking metalwork, wood carving, and textiles left patterns and techniques that continued into medieval Europe. Interlaced animals, knotwork, and symbolic motifs survived long after the gods that inspired them faded from worship. The survival of values, what truly outlived the Viking Age, were values. Courage in the face of uncertainty, respect for skill and competence, loyalty to kin and community, the belief that a person's actions mattered more than their fears. These ideas slipped quietly into the cultures Vikings touched and became part of broader European identity. Even Christianity, when it arrived in Scandinavia, adapted rather than erased. Christ was sometimes imagined as a warrior king. Saints replaced gods, but stories remained powerful. Honor shifted from battlefield to soul, but bravery was still admired. The Viking understanding of fate evolved, but the acceptance of life's unpredictability endured. People still faced storms, hardship, and loss, with a steady resilience that had been shaped over generations of living close to nature and danger. From myth to memory, as centuries passed, Vikings transformed into stories. Sagas were written down. Poems preserved names, battles, feasts, betrayals, and journeys. These stories were not just entertainment, they were memory devices, cultural anchors that preserved how people once understood the world. Later generations exaggerated them. Horned helmets appeared where none had existed. Violence grew louder in retelling, but beneath the myth, the humanity remained. Modern fascination with Vikings speaks less to their brutality and more to their clarity of purpose in an uncertain world. They lived simply, dangerously, and fully. They accepted death without obsession. They valued stories, skill, and belonging. In a world that often feels disconnected, that clarity still resonates. Echoes in the modern world today. Viking influence appears in unexpected places. In language, through words that slipped quietly into English and other tongues. In law, through early concepts of assemblies and collective judgment. In exploration, through the enduring pull of the horizon. In culture, through stories of resilience, honor, and self-determination. Even the romantic idea of the wanderer, the one who leaves home, faces the unknown, and returns changed owes something to the Viking raider. Not the caricature, but the human being behind it. The Viking Age ended, but the Viking way of facing the world did not. A quiet understanding. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Vikings is not found in swords or sagas, but in their calm relationship with uncertainty. They knew the world was dangerous. They knew the gods would fall. They knew storms came without warning. And still, they built ships. They told stories. They raised families. They sailed. They did not seek control over fate. They sought alignment with it. And that quiet wisdom, the understanding that life is brief, unpredictable, and worth meeting with courage, continues to whisper across centuries, like wind across a darkened sea. And now, the journey slows. The longship drifts back into still water. The oars rest. The sail loosens. Firelight flickers gently against the walls of the longhouse once more. Outside, the sea breathes in and out, patient and eternal. The Vikings, so often remembered as shadows of violence, reveal themselves here as something softer, more familiar. People who worked, worried, hoped, believed, and rested. People who lived close to the edge of the world and learned how to make peace with it. As the night deepens, let the waves fade into the distance. Let the stories settle. The gods are quiet now. The wind has calmed. And like the last embers of a hearth fire, the Viking world drifts gently into rest, leaving behind not fear, but memory. Sleep well.